أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum and good evening. Welcome to On the Couch with me, Farida Rabia and Soki in Zunzi. This is On the Couch together with Lately in Land and Housing, which is your weekly show that discusses current affairs in political landscape pertaining to housing, evictions, equitable access to land and tenure security. Today, we will uncover why expropriation has not benefited the landless and is there an alternative. Our guest this evening is Mpora Bona, who is an attorney at Difunakwazi, and Edward Molopi, who is a researcher at Socio-Economic Rights Institute of South Africa. Good evening and welcome to On the Couch.
Hi, Farida. Thanks for having us.
Good evening, Farida. Thank you for having us.
So, expropriation has been a topical issue, and if those who want to know more about it, you can find it on the Difunokwazi website. It's perceived that the death of land reform and whether there is any hope of real reform. So today we want to look at the expropriation of land as a tool for achieving land reform. And so we want to uncover some of the limitations of expropriation and explore the alternatives to this mechanism. Now, Edward, if we could start with you. Firstly, what is expropriation and how does it work?
Thanks, Farida. I think expropriation, so basically it's a tool wherein the state takes occupation of of property, and property, it does not necessarily just mean land. It could also extend to other property that is then taken. I mean, the idea is that it's for use for public good, and so that's the whole. So it's basically a mechanism in which the state is able to acquire property.
Imbo, if you could give us, maybe break this down for us, a practical, how does this look like in context where expropriation, how is it applied?
All right, Farida. So as it has said, the state uses the mechanism of expropriation to take whatever property that it needs for whatever public purpose, right? So a practical example of this would be, let's say the state needs to build a road or a hospital, and you'll find that there's someone who already lives in that place where these items have been planned. So what the state would do in that instance would be to expropriate that land needed to build the road or the hospital or the school or what have you, and then they would then pay the previous owner some compensation for the loss of their property, and then would take ownership or take transfer of that property in order to fulfill this public purpose. So in our example, that would be the hospital or the road or the school. And that's basically how it would work in a practical sense.
So now with the widespread and the growing tenure insecurity, which is linked to both our past and the current practices that are leading people to take robust measures, as we have seen with land occupations, so how is the ordinary South African supposed to understand expropriation and how it's beneficial to them?
So I think in the ordinary sense, if we could maybe rely on practical examples that have occurred in the past. So in the city of Johannesburg, for instance, there was a large-scale occupation where the numbers of occupiers on this privately owned land was so great that the state couldn't provide any alternative accommodation that would house everyone in this occupation. So in that instance, the state then went into negotiations with the owner of that land that had been occupied to say, listen, let me as the state rather buy this property from you, and then from there I'll develop this land where people have occupied, which is what we call in situ upgrading. So basically installing services all the way up to a top structure or a house, as or in the very place that people are, instead of having to move them first and then relocate them, etc. So that's one way in which the state could use this expropriation power to benefit people who don't have their own tenure security. And I think what's at issue here is the fact that many people across the country don't enjoy legal tenure or legal protection of their right to property. So just thinking about our history, and I know, Farida, you've discussed this in previous episodes, where dispossession and the past discriminatory laws have made it such that the majority weren't allowed to own land or property. And as an effect or as a result of that, we find that even today, the majority of our people are struggling with tenure insecurity, meaning that the places where they live, they don't have that legal right or legal protection against any removal, forced removal, or legal removal. And this is also because our property system as a country tends to prioritize ownership, right? So ownership is the king in terms of property rights, but all other rights like possessory rights fall under that. So without that legal tenure security, you may always be at risk of losing your home, being removed from the land that you're living on, etc.
I'd like your thoughts on that, Edward, as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I agree with Paul. So, I mean, I think the difficulty with expropriation is that it is a very state-led process. So you were asking about, communities and their interaction with expropriation, and that's the difficulty with it, that it is a very state-led process. And I mean, usually expropriation happens largely, is governed by the Expropriation Act. There are other sort of like legislations that also give relevant state departments ability to expropriate, such as the Housing Act. So what we see in that is that, particularly if you're looking at how this tool has been used, we've seen it in two different dispensations. We've seen it in the pre-1994 dispensation, so the pre-democratic dispensation, where it was largely used to dispossess people, particularly Black people and people of color out of their property closer to work opportunities, and to drive them away into the fringe of the urban core. And so what we then see post 1994 is that there is basically a reluctance from the state to use this for land reform purposes. So it's a tool that exists for that purpose, that the state can actually use this particular tool for land reform purposes. And so I think the difficulty, as I was saying, is that it's very state-led, and in instances where there is reluctance on the state to expropriate, communities find themselves in a very difficult positions.
Mm-hmm.
We've dealt with a couple of cases where communities, in fact, have been the ones who are saying, instead of you pursuing an eviction en masse, why not rather consider expropriation? One such community is an informal settlement in Philippines. It's called the Marikana Informal Settlement, where, I mean, we're looking at tens of thousands of households there, where people have been living on that land, but it's privately owned, with different owners of the property. So it's a huge plot of land, different even on it. And so there was an eviction case that was brought, and as part of the processes of the eviction case, one of the solutions that were brought about by the community with us as the Socioeconomic Rights Institute representing them was to say, maybe you should actually expropriate this land as per the powers given by the municipality in the Housing Act. But the city actually opposed that. So they were opposing, in essence, when you look at it, they were opposing efforts by a community to say, use the tool to ensure that there is access to urban land for the poor. And so I think that's and I could give you a few other examples of this case where communities have been the one coming forward and saying, here is a tool, use it. And we find the state actually taking efforts to fight against that.
That's really weird. That doesn't make sense, because we are struggling to get people into places or into houses and places that they can call home. So what was the reason that the state refused, especially if this tool is available?
Look, I mean, it's really sort of an issue of wanting to, I mean, I think, put it bluntly, it's a reluctance to expropriate for the kinds of people. So informal settlement dwellers. That's I think the underlying problem here. So eventually, I mean, I think it went into the Supreme Court of Appeal, and there was eventually a direction moving towards negotiating for the expropriation of that land. So yeah, I mean, I think essentially it's just municipalities being settled in their approach in how they want to deal with these matters. Often rather to relocate people to more, to temporary accommodation, rather than seeking a more long-term solution for the challenge.
So are we ultimately saying that expropriation is a long-term solution for our housing crisis?
Yes, I mean, if it's I think, given the sort of like the limitations that have given, if it can be used, so it's not the only tool that's there.
One of the tools.
There are many other tools, but I think it's one of the tools that can be used. I think what the conversation is highlighting is that it hasn't met its objectives, or it hasn't fulfilled what it hasn't realized its potential, mostly because of the state's reluctance to use it, particularly for that purpose. So, I mean, let's not say the state doesn't expropriate. The state does expropriate, but it's not for for urban land reform purposes. They'll expropriate to build the Gautrain railway, for example. They've used that in that instance. So it's that. So it's not to say that the state doesn't expropriate at all. The state does expropriate, but it doesn't expropriate for urban land reform purposes.
And why I sort of heard you wanting to come in there.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think 100% in agreement with Edward. And just to say that another limitation of solely relying on expropriation is that it's ultimately the state that will take transfer of that property. And we've seen with our states that there's no real guarantee that they will transfer the ownership of that land that they've expropriated back to the communities. So there's also a reluctance or a bit of a fear around the state not passing ultimate ownership to communities it would have expropriated on their behalf. And I think, Farida, I just want to share another story, just picking up on Ed's showing of the irony in terms of how the state has approached this matter. So similar to what Ed was saying, yes, expropriation was used as a tool in the apartheid era. But in terms of land reform, again, just highlighting what Ed has been saying, the state is reluctant to use this tool for redress. I think there's another case in District 6, a more recent case, where a family that had actually survived eviction through the Group Areas Act, all of the legislation that was aimed at pushing people out of District 6, that family survived all of that just to be evicted now in this new dispensation. And now they've ultimately resorted to asking the state to expropriate this land that they're on, to prevent them losing what is ultimately a place of significance, of historical significance, and ultimately to prevent the undoing of what this new dispensation promised us through land reform and redress.
There's a listener who sent in a message saying, "Good evening, thanks for the great program. Communique is an apartheid beneficiary that illegally occupied and stockpiled vast tracts of land under the apartheid slogan Swart Gevaar at the end of the Group Areas Act and Apartheid Rule. Communique also hijacked apartheid social housing that they are now selling off in Reiteweg. What options are there to pursue for tenants and claimants who want retribution and land tenure?"
All right, so that's a bit difficult because we can't verify those claims made around Communique's acquisition of these properties. But I think fundamentally here we need to understand the nature of social housing. And I think a lot of our people are under, a misguided understanding of what social housing essentially is. Social housing is not a means to own the property. It's a rental tenure. It's a rental arrangement. So that's one of the issues that we've come across a lot around tenants or former tenants of Communicare and similar social housing institutions wanting to claim ownership of rental unit or rental stock. But with respect to the claims around how Communicare acquired these properties, I'm not sure that we're well placed to comment, just given the lack of a factual basis, etc. But I think one would be wise to at least do a proper investigation and find out, go to the deeds registry, just trace through title deeds who's been in ownership of these properties and how they were acquired. If there is a case to be made against Communique, then that's something else. But at this point, I don't think we can comment authoritatively on these allegations.
So, with expropriation and the state maybe not focusing on housing but focusing on other things, do you feel that how much effort do we need to put in? Can we truly depend on the state when it comes to expropriation for the people when it comes to housing? And if not, what are the other solutions that we can look at? I know social housing is one of them, but it seems like in relation to land reform, how do we deal with that? State being reluctant to expropriate and not having the trust in the state to do that, and then land reform.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Firstly, on expropriation itself, so currently, as I've mentioned, that there's the Expropriation Act, which was in effect from like 1975, but there's also an expropriation bill that's currently in place, which seeks to repeal that Expropriation Act and bring about, so basically, a new Expropriation Act. That's an ongoing process, and I think we have the ability to make comments and inputs into that whole process. I know that there have been a number of consultations across the country where communities are given an opportunity to give input into the shaping of that, what would eventually become the new Expropriation Act. So, I mean, I think there's a chance now that as communities, we can actually make an effort to understand this act and also seek to shape it in such a way that it would act for us. I mean, part of those things is to ensure that there is public participation in the whole expropriation process. And one of the other things, as I've mentioned, that this is a very state-led process. Maybe there's a way to dilute that, and we can look at mechanisms by which state communities can actually initiate and activate the expropriation process. So I think there's an opportunity at the moment to try and look into carving the Expropriation Act to be in a way that would be able to allow us to input into that whole process, and to also, as communities, be able to say, we want to activate this process rather than it solely being a state-only process. I mean, the powers will still remain the state. The state will basically be the ones that have the power to expropriate, but at least the activation or the initiation of the process, if that can have community input. And then I think what Mpoa is also highlighting is what eventually happens once the property has been acquired, who holds ownership. And that's also, I think, one of the other things that we can look to revise, so that communities actually get to benefit on that. But yeah, I mean, I think outside of the expropriation process itself, there are a number of other mechanisms and legislations that are in place. Some, of course, not used to their full potential, wherein issues of land reform can be fast-tracked. There are policies that seek to assist people who live in informal settlements, for example, such as the upgrading of informal settlements program. There are other initiatives and programs that exist. So, I mean, I think there is a bit of a landscape of laws and policies that relate to housing that, I mean, I think a lot of them are not implemented in the manner that they should be. And so we're still seeing that we are not realizing the potential that all of these suite of laws can achieve if they were actually used to their full potential.
Whose responsibility is it for these laws to be used to its full capacity?
I mean, it's the state, unfortunately, at various spheres of the state. There are ones that deal directly with what national is supposed to be doing. There are ones that deal with what the provincial and also what local government should be doing. But I think even at the core of it, the Constitution gives guidance that firstly, Section 26(1) says that everyone has the right of access to adequate housing. And then Section 26(2) then puts an obligation on the state to put in reasonable legislative mechanisms and any other efforts within, the available resources to ensure that it brings about the realization of this access to adequate housing. So in terms of who is responsible, it is the state that is ultimately responsible. We are just seeing a lot of initiatives from communities to try and assist the state to say, hey, look, you seem to be forgetting what you're supposed to be doing. We are still here. We are still in need of housing. How about you get about doing your job? So yeah, I mean, I think the state is responsible, and communities are there to hold them accountable to that.
So if we don't make use of this tool, and we are slacking with the other tools, the chances are that informal settlements will just keep on growing, and people will be in these uncomfortable places and far away from opportunities and so on. And if we have to hold these public meetings and get public opinion, but still the state is moving slowly, I mean, that just leaves people behind. That it's almost like you don't really have anything to look forward to, because I come to the place and I tell you this is what we need. The community has been waiting, and I hear you, Edward, you use the word trying. We don't need to try anymore. We need to make things happen.
I think you're right, Farida. At this point in time, I think a lot of our people are feeling that sense of despondency, because we have been waiting on a lot of promises made by the state, which to this day remain unfulfilled. But I think the common denominator here is the lack of political will. So with all these mechanisms, these progressive policies and laws that exist to essentially help us realize the promises of the Constitution, the lack of political will to actually activate them is essentially what's holding us back in terms of redress, in terms of reform, in terms of ensuring that the population does get access to adequate housing. I mean, Ed was talking about the Constitution. Even looking at this question of tenure security, Section 25(6) does say that people who were legally or who have legally insecure tenure as a result of these past racially discriminatory laws or practices are entitled to legally secure tenure, or at least comparable redress. But we find today that it's those very same people who are dispossessed or who are descendants of those who are dispossessed who find themselves in precarious spaces like these informal settlements, constantly looking over their shoulder at the threat of an eviction. So I think Ed was saying that communities are now starting to rise up and trying to create an impetus for the state to act. And I think one of the ways that the communities that we have been working with are looking at doing this is using the laws that the state has created, in our case, apartheid-era laws, for their benefit. And I think one such law that communities are looking to use creatively is the State Land Disposal Act. Now, this is an act from 1961, so you know that the intention was probably to dispossess for the benefit of the few. But in this case, what that specific act enables the president or ministers with delegated authority to do is to actually dispose, which means sell, lease, or give, in terms of donating, land or property to individuals or communities. And this can be done via request. So what the Act does is it gives the president and the ministers discretionary power. So they have the power to decide whether or not to give this property that's been requested by these communities to them for their development, for them to build a dignified life, for them to possibly secure housing, but most importantly, for them to enjoy tenure security. So this is one of the ways that communities don't just have to wait for the state, but communities can use this legislation as a type of prodding stick to say, hey, we're still here. We know our entitlements. We know your responsibilities. And I think right now we're in a very special moment because looking at the elections coming ahead, there's a political moment that the nation is in right now. And questions of accountability, questions of failures around provision of housing, tenure security, redistribution, all of those are coming to the fore when we debate things like land. So the politicians would be very hard pressed to say or to give reasons why they haven't been and why they can't or why they won't continue to give communities some level of secure tenure. And I think the problem is growing at an alarming rate, just given the state of our nation, the state of our economy, the cost of living crisis. A lot of us who are in the middle class now find ourselves as the precarious middle class, meaning that if I can't afford next month's rent, I'm essentially homeless. And that's a form of tenure insecurity as well. So a lot of our people are actually facing this issue of tenure insecurity. And that's why it's so important for people out there to actually rise up and hold the state to account and essentially try and activate mechanisms to secure their own tenure and their children's tenure, etc.
Because we are speaking about generations and people that need to get out of this.
Yeah.
We have about 5 minutes left. If we could get your closing thoughts, Edward.
Yeah, I mean, I think, sorry, I was just thinking about what my closing thoughts but in a more succinct way. But yeah, I mean, I think when we speak about expropriation, we do I think acknowledge that it's a tool that's there, that it's not the only tool, and it can never be the only tool that is used. And I think we are at a moment now where we can, I think, refine it in such a way that it actually works to our own reality. because I mean, I think there's even a lot of, I think, opposition to it as it stands, because I think if you ask a lot of people about expropriation, they think it's just a way of the state to take away people's homes. And people aren't looking at it in terms of what it means for land reform purposes, and also what it can achieve for us. So, I mean, I think it's a tool that's there, but it hasn't been utilized in the way that it should be utilized. And I mean, I think maybe if there's a challenge that I would give to people is that, and to the listeners, is that we take a moment to to read up on these things. There is information that's available. For example, you've already at the start of the show, Farida, directed people to the NU website, where some of this information is available. We've also made a couple of inputs to this process in terms of policy submissions, that's also available on the SERI website. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a tool that's there. Let's try and in our respective ways try and get the state to use it in the way that it is supposed to be used to achieve land reform.
Impo?
Farida, I was actually expecting something around expropriation without compensation, and how we're gonna end up like Zimbabwe, those stories. But I think I agree with Ed. I think the challenge or the call here, especially to the listeners, is to engage with the processes that are happening around you. Like it says, the expropriation bill is currently before Parliament. Do make submissions, do engage with these participatory processes. But I think further than that, I think we as a nation need to start thinking about our tenure security, and we need to start thinking about how we interact and engage with land even beyond the state. I think we've reached a point where communities at large are utterly tired of waiting for the state, be it food delivery, etc., etc. We see some communities doing their own service delivery, and that's just the point at which we're at. But I think looking at what's available to us as communities, as the nation, in terms of these laws and policies, and activating them for our good, for our benefit, would be something that I would encourage. In as much as the state does bear responsibility ultimately, I think we also have to take up a level of agency in securing our future as well.
And on that note, thank you, Impo. Thank you, Edward, for speaking to us this evening. Until we chat next week, have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. Bye.
That was Impo Rabona, who's an attorney at Difonokwazi, and Edward Molopi, who's a researcher at the Socioeconomic Rights Institute of South Africa, speaking to us about expropriation and why it has not benefited the landless, and if there is an alternative. And they have mentioned that it is one of the tools. But let me know what your thoughts are on this conversation and for next week. I'm Farida Rabia and Soke in Zinzi. Up next is Reflections with Ayub Ali. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.